In 1928, Catherine Donahue, a former dial painter, testified in court with her jaw wired shut, a gruesome result of radium poisoning that had disintegrated her jawbone, leaving her in constant agony. Hundreds of women like Catherine were poisoned and left to die by their employers in a horrific case of corporate greed and negligence. A dark chapter in American history that would become known as the Radium Girls scandal. But here's where it gets dark. These women were not just victims of circumstance. They were deliberately misled and exploited by the very companies they worked for. Companies that knew the dangers of radium poisoning but chose to ignore them in pursuit of profit. And this is where everything fell apart. As the women's bodies began to deteriorate, their bones crumbling, their skin glowing in the dark, a ghastly side effect of radium poisoning that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The story begins in the early 1900s, when radium was a highly sought-after element, used to create glow-in-the-dark watch faces, a novelty item that was all the rage at the time. Companies like the United States Radium Corporation and the Waterbury Clock Company hired hundreds of women to paint these watch faces, often using radium-laced paint to achieve the desired glow. The women, mostly teenagers and young adults, were told that the paint was harmless, that it was even good for their health, and they were encouraged to moisten their brushes with their tongues, thereby ingesting small amounts of radium every day. Nobody talks about this part, but the companies knew that radium was highly toxic, and they took steps to protect their male workers, providing them with masks and gloves, while the women were left to paint with their bare hands and tongues. As the years went by, the women began to fall ill, suffering from a range of symptoms, including anemia, bone cancer, and necrosis of the jaw, a condition that would come to be known as radium jaw. But here's the thing. The companies knew about the dangers of radium poisoning long before the women started getting sick. In 1906, a scientist named Marie Curie had discovered the toxic properties of radium. And by the 1910s, there were already reports of radium poisoning in the medical literature. However, the companies chose to ignore these warnings, and instead, they launched a campaign of misinformation, telling the women that their symptoms were caused by everything from syphilis to tuberculosis, but never radium poisoning. And this is where it gets really dark. The companies even went so far as to pay off doctors to misdiagnose the women, to tell them that they were suffering from some other disease, anything but radium poisoning. As a result, many women died, their bodies ravaged by the very thing they had been told was harmless. A testament to the corporate greed and negligence that defined the radium industry. As the women's health continued to deteriorate, they began to organize, to fight for their rights and for justice. In 1927, a group of former dial painters, including Catherine Donahue, sued the United States Radium Corporation, alleging that the company had knowingly exposed them to toxic materials. The case, which would become known as Donahue v. United States Radium Corporation, was a landmark moment in the struggle for women's rights, as it highlighted the ways in which women were being exploited and mistreated in the workplace. But here's the thing. The companies fought back, using every trick in the book to discredit the women and avoid taking responsibility for their actions. They claimed that the women were lying, that they were just trying to get attention and money, and they even went so far as to accuse them of being promiscuous, of having loose morals, as if that had anything to do with the fact that they had been poisoned by radium. And this is where everything fell apart. As the women's bodies continued to deteriorate, their lives slipping away, all while the companies continued to deny any wrongdoing. The trial was a sensationalized media event, with newspapers and magazines across the country covering the story of the Radium Girls. The women's testimony, including Catherine Donahue's, was a powerful indictment of the companies, and it helped to galvanize public opinion, to turn the tide of the case in their favor. But here's the thing. The companies still refused to take responsibility, still refused to acknowledge the harm they had caused. It wasn't until 1928, when the women won their case, that the companies finally began to take steps to protect their workers. to provide them with safe working conditions and adequate compensation for their injuries. And this is where it gets really dark. Even then, the companies tried to find ways to avoid paying the women, to avoid taking care of them, even as they lay dying from radium poisoning. As the years went by, the women's health continued to decline, and many of them died, their bodies ravaged by the very thing they had been told was harmless. A testament to the enduring legacy of corporate greed and negligence. The Radium Girls scandal was a watershed moment in the struggle for women's rights, as it highlighted the ways in which women were being exploited and mistreated in the workplace. The case led to changes in labor laws, including the establishment of the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, and it paved the way for future generations of women to fight for their rights. But here's the thing. The legacy of the Radium Girls is still felt today, as women continue to fight for justice and equality in the workplace. The story of the Radium Girls is a powerful reminder of the dangers of corporate greed and negligence, and it serves as a warning to companies that prioritize profits over people. And this is where everything comes full circle, as we remember the women who suffered and died, their bodies glowing in the dark. A haunting reminder of the horrors of radium poisoning, and the importance of fighting for justice and equality in the workplace. The Radium Girls may be gone, but their story will never be forgotten. A dark chapter in American history that will continue to haunt us for generations to come. Subscribe for more stories like this, and join us next time as we explore another dark chapter in human history.